Today I'm joined by Robert Sikes, who is a professional natural bodybuilder that has followed a ketogenic / carnivore diet for over 10 years. In this video he's going to share all of his best advice regarding building muscle and losing fat whilst on a carnivore diet, as well as how you can do both at the same time. Firstly, I'd like to ask you, how much protein do you think people should be eating to build muscle when on a low carb diet? There's an argument that when you're in a low carbohydrate state, because your body needs some sugar in the form of glucose to function, it will convert some of the protein you're eating into glucose, and therefore you need more protein when you're in a low carbohydrate state. Do you believe this to be true, and what do you think is the right amount of protein to be aiming for optimal muscle growth when in a low carbohydrate state?
I mean, the brain definitely do need some glucose, and it can derive what little it does need from gluconeogenesis. But I don't really ever recommend increasing protein intake for that metabolic pathway to happen specifically. I mean, it's pretty trivial the amount that is needed. So honestly, I typically take people through an increasing protein amount week after week to figure out what their unique protein threshold is, and it kind of changes depending on the goals. A good general rule of thumb that is pretty safe is 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight or pound of lean mass would be a pretty fair middle of the road recommendation.
hmm When you say protein threshold, what do you mean by that?
So when I'm taking people through a fat loss phase, I've got multiple phases, but I'll typically start them at a higher fat ratio in general, especially if they're not deeply fat adapted yet. So by default, I'll start them with a higher fat percentage, and then that means protein is going to be lower. And then each week, I'll increase their protein intake until they start to exhibit some adverse responses, such as GI distress, bloating, brain fog, inflamed joints. And at that point, in the context of the lower carbohydrate, I kind of that's indicative of them hitting that protein threshold. So
Mhm.
at that point, I'll start stabilizing protein intake or even drop it off slightly.
Okay. And now you work with people who are on a ketogenic diet and a carnivore diet. Do you find that this protein threshold is a bit higher for those on carnivore just because they don't have these plants that, often mess with digestion and whatnot?
Not really, because even with the people that I'm doing on a ketogenic standpoint, like my total carb recommendations are always very, very low, like 20
Mhm.
grams or lower, oftentimes 10 grams total carbs or less. And that typically just comes from trivial sources like what people are finding in, heavy cream or, some dairies or things like that, like if they're doing like a, yogurt or something, for instance. But most of my clients aren't consuming copious amounts of vegetation anyways. Now, if someone is consuming a ton of vegetation, they're taking in 50 grams of total carbs. That could cause a flux in, fluid retention levels. And if they've got a sensitivity to it, some more joint pain and inflammation, which could act as a confounding variable. But generally speaking, whether my clients are keto or carnivore, the protein threshold is going to hold pretty much consistent regardless.
That makes sense. Okay. Now, you've followed a low carbohydrate approach for, what is it, 10 years now? Quite a
Yeah, it's
while.
probably getting closer to 11 now. Pretty good while.
Wow. Uh-huh. But before that, you were on the traditional higher carb approach. With your training, how do you train differently on a high carb and a low carb approach? Like, for example, do you find you recover better so you can have more volume?
I do recover really good. Like I don't ever get sore anymore, no matter
Mhm.
how heavy and hard I go with a training session. So I could train the same muscle group more frequently now with the ketogenic approach versus that of when I was eating carbs.
Mhm.
But like the actual training style, as far as like the sets and reps, and like the exercises I'm doing, that's held pretty consistent, whether regardless of the diet I'm following. But honestly, just the improved recovery and ability to train with more frequency is probably the biggest difference.
So how many total sets per week do you typically aim for when you're in a building phase trying to build some muscle?
I don't know how many total sets. I'm typically doing 5 to 6 different exercises per day, of which each has about 4 to 6 sets, and then I'll train usually five days a week is pretty average for my training day schedule.
Okay. And so is there like a set number you typically aim for? Like say, this week I'd like to 10 sets of my chest, 10 sets of my back, etc. Or is it more just based on feel?
It's really based on feel. Like I've been doing a full body routine, so I'll train my entire body every single time I train. I'll pick
Okay.
one exercise per body muscular region, and
hmm
I'll attack that. Usually, I'll factor in one compound lift for body part at some point throughout the week. But I'm pretty intuitive with what exercises I'm doing that day based off of how I'm feeling. And then depending on the exercise, I may just stick to, 4 sets, a standard 15, 12, 10, 8, getting progressively heavier with each set. Or if I'm doing like a compound movement like deadlifts or squats, for instance, I might be doing, 6 to 10 sets in a lower rep range. So it kind of just honestly is based off, feel and intuition when it comes to the nitty gritty like that.
Interesting. What advantages do you see with a full body approach every day rather than, traditional splits such as push pull legs?
Honestly, just the increased frequency. So because I have less inflammation and soreness with keto, I can train much more frequently. So for me to be able to increase my frequency to the point where I'm targeting legs, for instance, every single day I train, I feel like that increased frequency has led to better shape, better symmetry, better growth overall. So since I don't get sore, I wanted to kind of capitalize on that, and a full body routine is the best way to capitalize on that frequency.
What we hear in the mainstream is the more meals per day is better. When you're trying to build muscle, you want to be eating as soon as you're awake, eating before you go to bed. This is the mainstream view, and the science somewhat supports this. It shows that the more meals you have per day, the better growth is. However, all of those studies are obviously done on people on a high carbohydrate diet. So when you're fat adapted, this really changes things. How many meals per day do you recommend to people when they're in a gaining phase?
Honestly, I mean, the main thing to be in a gaining phase is to make sure you're in a caloric surplus to some extent. So you're going to need to spread out your meals in such a way that you can get more food in. But from like a muscle protein synthesis standpoint, you only really need to spike that a couple times a day. So each time you have, an ample protein containing meal with, enough adequate leucine, you're going to spike muscle protein synthesis. But also when you train, you're going to spike muscle protein synthesis. So when I'm training in the morning, and then eating, 2 meals, for instance, I'm getting 3 spikes a day, which is totally sufficient for growth. And then when I'm in a cutting phase, I kind of tend to gravitate towards OMAD, so just 1 meal a day. And that's worked really well for preserving the lean tissue that I've built in the building phase. So yeah, I used to be guilty of that too, man. I would eat every 2 or 3 hours. Like I used to set my alarm for midnight. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, eat like a protein bar, and just do all kinds of crazy stuff that is no longer necessary. I mean, when you're eating quality fats and proteins, they absorb much more slowly. They're assimilated by the body much more slowly, so you can go significantly longer between meals without any adverse effect.
Hmm. That's interesting. You mentioned about 1 meal per day when you're cutting. Well, why do you do that?
For me, psychologically, I would rather have, and my calories are lower when I'm cutting, so I'm hungrier. And for me, psychologically, I would rather have one larger meal that actually satiates me and fills me up to some extent, as opposed to multiple smaller meals scattered throughout the day that just always leave me wanting more food.
I've heard you say that you typically eat this meal very early in the day. Is there a reason behind that?
When I'm deep into a cut, I always train in the morning. So I'll typically try and have that one meal within the 2 hour window of training. When I am very depleted. And if I'm training at 5 or 6 in the morning, I'm typically having that meal around, 9 or 10 usually.
Do you not find that come the afternoon you're hungry, or is that meal just so satiating that it gets you through the next day?
I'm definitely hungry when I'm that
Uh-huh.
far into a prep, but I feel like for me, it's just like I flip a switch. Like when I'm in prep, it's go time. I don't deviate. I don't, take chances. It's just that's the chapter of life that I'm in, and I can enjoy that large meal. I can get excited about it, and then when it's over, it's like okay, time to just buckle down until the next meal the following day.
Is there a difference in like body fat percentage where you really start to feel the full effects of prep? Like for example, on a high carb diet, maybe at about 15%, you start feeling okay, I'm getting a little bit hungry now. Whereas on low carb, it's much lower. Is there a difference in that?
Yeah, I mean, things get interesting. It's gonna be different for males and females, obviously, but for guys, when you start getting down below 8%, you can definitely start to see it, flux in your leptin and ghrelin hormones, so your hunger becomes more rampant. And then when you start getting below 5% for a guy, things just start changing, man. Like your hair
Mhm.
stops growing, your nails stop growing. Like you're literally running in real time. Like what you eat that day is being used that day, as opposed to having any buffer whatsoever.
Uh-huh. But is there a difference in how low you can go before you really start to get hungry on a high carb versus low carb approach?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot more volume with high carbs. So like there's kind of different levels of satiety. So like when people eat a bunch of, voluminous foods, a lot of salads or, rice or something like that, their stomach feels full, but it's not like deeply satiating. And where with keto, with the fat adapted approach, you're not taking in as much food volume, but you feel, deeply satisfied. So what I've found that when I was eating carbs so long ago now, it seemed as though I could, probably get sub 12%, and then I'd really start getting hungry because I have to be pushing my calories down pretty low at that point. Whereas now, I mean, I'm definitely hungry still with the keto approach, but I feel like my, satiety and honestly my cognition is just so much better even at the lower calories that the rest of the world is still sustainable. Like my day-to-day functions are still fine. Like I'm able to just go about my day without being hindered.
Hmm. And for all the viewers at home, when Robert talks about, getting hungry, it's because he's getting like ridiculously shredded. So if you're someone who's overweight looking to get down to a normal body fat percentage, being on a low carbohydrate diet is definitely the best bet to get in shape
Oh, for
without being
sure.
starving. Yeah, yeah,
For sure. I mean, from a like sustainability standpoint, like if you're eating intuitively, it's much
yeah.
easier to do that with a keto carnivore approach because you don't have the flux in blood sugar levels. Like you're eating more nutrient dense foods. Like your body's going to require all of its micronutrient needs to be met. And you can hit those requirements much more efficiently with nutrient dense foods as opposed to hyperpalatable processed junk foods. So like you're able to get a lot more bang for the proverbial buck with fewer calories if it's all coming from good sources.
100%. Have you found it easier or harder to build muscle on a low carbohydrate diet?
It's interesting, man. I get that question a lot because a lot of people are, they hold the belief that you have to have insulin spiked massively via carbohydrates to build muscle. And insulin is an extreme growth agent. It causes growth of all types of tissue, muscle tissue, fat tissue, cancer cell growth, all kinds of growth. So you could make an argument that you might be able to build more, have more hypertrophic growth and muscle with insulin being elevated. But the caveat is when you do that, you're also seeing more fat gain as well. So that when you diet down to lean out and lose that fat, you have to diet more aggressively and you're at a higher risk of losing that extra muscle. So when it's all settled, the smoke settles and the dust clears, I don't feel like at the end of the day when I step on stage, I would have had any more muscle had I gone the carbohydrate route.
When it comes to like trying to get as shredded as possible, how would you recommend someone goes about that on a carnivore diet?
Well, selfishly, I would recommend they check out my course because I detail it all, very involved on my course. But I've got that 7 phase protocol that you mentioned earlier, and basically, it's taking people figuring out what their baseline is because everybody's going to be unique. Everyone's going to be different. There's no cookie cutter plan. Like you got to figure out what your starting point is, figure out what your baseline intake is, make sure that's a healthy intake to begin with, and then you can go through these macro manipulations on a week by week basis, whether you're increasing your protein, decreasing your fat, or decreasing both. And then towards the end, as calories are lower and they're leaner, I'll start throwing in, strategic ketogenic or caloric refeeds that make it more sustainable and kind of give an acute bump in metabolic rate. So going through that is the key, and then reverse dieting out of that back up to a healthy baseline is what it's all about. Because so many people go through these, crazy fat loss phases, but they do it really aggressively. They hack off way too many calories early on. Their metabolism down regulates, the hormone function is diminished, and it's not sustainable. They plateau and then they don't know where to turn after that. So it's definitely a long game approach for sure, but it's healthier.
Hmm. When it comes to these refeeds, is it typically many days on end, or is it just like a one day where you bump up the total food?
Kind of depends how depleted you are. So I'll typically start people with just a single day. And then from a competitive standpoint, that refeed also allows them to peak for the show day. So like if the show is on Saturday, then we'll do that refeed on Friday. And then based off the electrolyte manipulations and the food intake, they'll bring their best package the following day on Saturday. When I was super depleted in my 23 prep, 3.9% body fat, I was having a several consecutive refeed days to kind of fill out all the more. But generally speaking, most people would suffice with just one single refeed day a week.
Hmm. When people are dieting down, do you find a higher protein or higher fat approach works better? I've heard you talk about some experiments you've run yourself where you have your protein down to like 90 grams per day or something very, very low. What do you find works best?
So honestly, the higher fat is key, and here's why. So protein is obviously anti-catabolic, which is important. You have to have ample protein, but if you are fat adapted, if you've got high circulating ketones, those are also anti-catabolic. So you're not likely going to lose muscle tissue for a short period of time in which your protein is low. And I would rather partition those calories to dietary fat because that's where the energy comes from. And the energy is going to be what lets you train hard and with intensity in that depleted state. And continuing to train with intensity and keep that muscle in demand is the single best thing you could do to preserve that muscle. So at the end of the day, people typically bring a better package on show day and just a better physique overall if they, prioritize the fat in those last few weeks or month of a fat loss phase.
Interesting. So do you gradually bring the protein down, try and bring the fat up as you get super lean?
Yeah, I'll bring the fat up, and then the refeeds will be a dose of fat and protein, but with an emphasis on the dietary fat.
Okay. Now, if someone was like really overweight starting out, right? Say over 20% body fat, would you recommend at that point that a higher protein approach might be fine just because they have that extra body fat to draw from?
They can typically go a little higher on the ratio of protein. I generally always, even with the clients that are starting from a heavier body fat, like my protein as a percentage of or fat as a percentage of total calories still is higher, on a gram by gram basis. But they may be able to push that protein a little bit higher than somebody that's very lean because they do have that body fat to tap into. But they also have to make sure their training is on point, and if they start to see their energy diminished and their training intensity and volume decreased, like they're just as at risk of losing that muscle tissue as well. And the more muscle you lose, the lower your metabolic rate as a result of that loss of muscle. So anything you can do to preserve lean tissue in the context of a deficit is paramount, regardless of how overweight you are at the onset.
hmm I've heard you talk about, some interesting things that seem to happen with your metabolism when you're on the high fat, low carbohydrate approach. You said in the past you've bulked up very heavy, whereas when you're, following this low carbohydrate diet, you sort of get stuck at a weight and you just seem to not be able to put on any more weight at a certain point. Can you share experiences with that?
Yeah, I mean, I did so when I did my first crazy bulk with carbs before my keto days, I bulked up to 230 was my heaviest, I believe. And I was eating about 6,000 calories a day at that point. And now if I'm trying to be as aggressive and sloppy in a building phase as possible with a ketogenic standpoint, I can eat more calories than that because obviously fat's more calorically dense. So I can get more total food in, and I don't really ever get that high in body fat. Like I typically like I got up to 200 pounds in a ketogenic building phase after my 23 prep, and that was fatter than I needed to be. But I was consuming literally 8,000 calories on a regular basis. So it seems to be much harder to put on just obnoxious levels of adipose tissue
Mhm.
once you are fat adapted. You can still
Uh,
get fat, obviously, but like getting sloppier is much harder to do.
mhm. How are you even getting these 8,000 calories in? Obviously, you have your keto brick, but like,
Oh
that's
man,
insane.
I could easily be a competitive eater as well as a bodybuilder if I wanted to. I mean, I can put down some food, so that I've never really had an issue with that.
Did you find like, GI issues with that much fat and whatnot?
No, I mean, honestly, as long as the ratio is dialed in, I don't really ever have any GI distress from it. So like I can eat, 500 grams of fat, no problem. And I can have 500 grams of protein, no problem. As long as my fat to protein ratio is in a pretty good blend, then I don't typically have any GI distress from it.
One thing I hear reported time and time again by people on carnivore is that they can consume a lot more calories even when they're cutting. Have you had experience with this?
Yeah, I do feel like I consume more calories on average now being keto than when I was eating carbs. But there is definitely still a point at which the total energy intake still applies. I mean, if you're eating keto carnivore and you eat excessively, like your body still will put on body fat. Like it has to
Mhm,
store that somehow or another. A lot of people have higher expenditure with keto as well, carnivore as well, and there is a slight increase in thermic effect of food when there's more protein consumed. So that's getting factored into the equation as well. But all else equal, if your expenditure by way of activities and need activity doesn't change, and you just get obnoxiously, eat nothing but fatty brisket all day long, and your total caloric intake is through the roof, like you'll still gain body fat with a carnivore approach.
mhm. Have you run any experiments on that, like with yourself?
Yeah, I'm always experimenting, man. Like I am
Mhm,
I am always experimenting. I did a pretty interesting experiment about a month ago, kind of as a response to this sugar diet craze that was really viral about a month ago. It's kind of died down now. But everybody was talking about consuming just obnoxious levels of sugar to increase metabolic rate. And I basically replicated the same thing with a very high dietary fat ratio, like 87% of my calories coming from fat and incredibly low protein. And I exhibited the same results, except I also doubled my testosterone in the process. And none of
Interesting.
the people following the sugar diet were able to report that functionality.
Hmm. When you say very low protein, what was your protein at?
So for this experiment, there was a study done a while back, and their recommendation was protein was not to consist of more than, I believe, 9% of total calories for the day. And for me, I was targeting about 4,000 calories a day. So I was consuming probably like, I think 80 grams of protein, between 50 and 80 grams of protein a day, I believe is what it wound up being.
Okay. And what results did you see from that?
Well, I did it for a 2 week span. Like I said, my testosterone, both
Yeah.
total and
In
free,
terms of fat loss, sorry, I meant.
I didn't try to lose fat, so I actually increased calories for this experiment so that I
Mhm,
wouldn't lose any fat. Like my goal was to keep stable weight.
mhm.
So I basically figured out what intake I needed to consume in order to maintain stable weight. So had I done the same experiment, keeping calories the same, then I would have likely dropped weight and leaned out. But I actually wanted to maintain weight, so I just had to increase total intake to accomplish that.
And what was your, quote, maintenance calories at the time?
About 3,000 to 3,300, and then I went up to 4,000 and maintained weight as well.
That's very interesting. Mhm. When it comes to getting super lean, I think, one of the most important things is satiety. A diet only works if someone can stick to it. Even though dairy is considered a ketogenic food in many cases with things like butter, do you find that it doesn't quite fill people up quite as much?
It really just kind of depends on the individual, man. Like I don't have any issues with dairy. Lactose doesn't have any negative effect on me. I don't have any intolerances to it, and I enjoy it. I find it relatively satiating. Like I'll put some heavy cream in my coffee, and that tides me over for quite some time. Some people don't find drinking calories to be satiating. For me personally, when I start chewing food, my hunger tends to ramp up. So the longer I can postpone chewing food, the better off I am from a satiety standpoint. So, if I'm drinking some dairy in my coffee, that tends to do pretty well for me.
Hmm. I'm very interested. Do you have any more of these experiments that you've run yourself?
Oh yeah, man. I've got books full of experiments. The next
Let's
one
see
I'm
your,
going
your
to
best
do.
couple or something.
So the sugar diet, high fat version of it. I didn't do the sugar obviously, but that was a recent one. I'm doing like alternate day fasting to some extent here lately, and that's been an interesting experiment. I'm always doing an experiment when I'm competing because I'm trying new things to see what I can apply for myself and my clients. Actually, am going to be doing a really fish focused experiment in the next few weeks. Just really trying to get more, fish oils in via sardines and mackerel and cod and things like that. So I'm going to be doing a couple blood work tests, and that will be my next experiment in the docket. But yeah, I'm always playing around with something.
Hmm. From these experiments, have you found any things that really surprised you?
Um, yeah, I've always learned something from it. I mean, honestly, just really getting granular with the protein requirements, and it's pretty crazy how low I've taken my protein and not lost any lean tissue if done for a finite period of time. So it really kind of puts my mind at rest as a bodybuilder. I'm obviously wanting to build and grow as much muscle as possible. But if you're strategic in how you go about your macro distribution, for a finite period of time, you can go pretty low on protein without actually losing any lean tissue if you are fat adapted. And that's interesting to me because nobody in the traditional bodybuilding space does a ketogenic diet. Um, and they're always trying to preserve muscle as well, and they'll have protein incredibly high. But I've seen more loss of lean tissue when my protein is very high following a carbohydrate approach than when my protein was significantly lower, but I was fat adapted.
The final thing I'd like to talk about is body recompositions. For people who are newish to resistance training, it's certainly possible. Obviously, if you've been in the gym for years, you're going to need to be in these, gaining and leaning out phases. But how would you recommend going about things for someone looking to lose fat and build muscle at the same time?
Yeah, so if you're like a newbie, you can totally capitalize on newbie gains because all of the training that you do is going to be an entirely new stimulus for your body. So this is kind of like one of those Goldilocks phases where you could, effectively build muscle and lose fat simultaneously. I see a lot of people that are new to the gym, trying, like, if they're not overweight, then they probably shouldn't go into a legitimate, deficit cutting phase. Like, give your body everything it needs from a fuel standpoint, from an amino acid standpoint, to capitalize on building as much tissue as possible during that prime time. And then just make the most of it. And then if you are somebody that has way too much fat on their frame, then they can certainly, do both at the same time, build muscle and lose fat. But their body's gonna be very responsive. I mean, it's like a 6-month window where you just, have incredible gains.
Mhm.
So training hard, training heavy, getting nutrient dense foods in, and just making the most of that chapter is the recommendation. Don't skip leg day. Like, when I first started working out, I didn't do legs for the first 6 months, and that was not good.
Only 6 months, mate. It took me about 2, 3 years before I started hitting legs.
Yeah, you got to do legs, man. You got to do legs. I was playing catch up on my lower body for a long time
Yeah,
because during my newbie gain phase, I didn't do legs. So yeah, you don't want to make that mistake.
100%. Awesome. Thank you very much for coming on. Where can people find more of you?
I'm all on social, all online. Keto Savage is my handle. I've got a very involved course that takes people through all this at ketobodybuilding.com. And then if anybody's interested in the meal replacement bar that I make that's ketogenic, it's at ketobrick.com.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.